A freeze in the conflict would play into Ukrainian hands better. It would give Europe more time to spend the new money that is allocated to defense, particularly in Germany, billions and billions of extra money being allocated to defense, and a lot of that going to Ukraine. It would also really help give Ukraine rest its soldiers, rotate them. It would help Ukraine bringing in a new crop of mobilized soldiers who would know that they were going to be trained for a period of time before being immediately deployed to the front line. So it would really help Ukraine to pause the conflict. And that's precisely the reason that I think that Russia is not really interested in that. Russia sees now that it's got the momentum. It's making, although incremental gains, it is surrounding two key towns in the Donbass, Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk. And Putin won't want to lose that momentum.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Maxim Tucker, the Times' Ukraine correspondent. Maxim, thank you very much for joining us again.
Good to see you.
Well, Maxim, as everyone now knows, we are expecting to hear about this meeting between Trump and Putin coming in days. There's now a lot of doubt cast on whether or not Ukraine are going to be involved at all in this summit. Do you think Zelensky is going to be there?
I don't think so, because Putin has suggested that he doesn't want to meet Zelensky, that the preconditions that he has set for a meeting with Zelensky have not been met. And I think that Trump is using the idea of a meeting with Putin to kick the can down the road in terms of implementing his sanctions. I think it's a game of geopolitical theatre that we're seeing now from Trump. He doesn't want to impose sanctions on someone he considers as an ally, essentially President Putin. We've seen him change his attitude, not his attitude really, his rhetoric on Putin over the past few weeks. But actually, if you look back at what he's done, it's remarkably consistent. He is withdrawn support for Ukraine. He's cut humanitarian funding to Ukrainian programs. And he has at times paused intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And he's making it very difficult for Ukraine to continue on the battlefield. So I don't expect that to change during his meeting with Putin that's coming up.
So from people you're speaking with in Ukraine, is there any expectation of some sort of win coming out of these possible talks for Ukraine?
I think the most that Ukrainians expect at the moment are the continued prisoner exchanges. They are seeing that a large number of soldiers are being returned to Ukraine in exchange for prisoners of war being returned to Russia. I think Ukrainians do want to see that continue. Any small changes in terms of, that it's been mooted that there might be a cessation of airstrikes for some time, that would be welcomed by the Ukrainians, obviously. But I don't think there is a great deal of optimism. I mean, I think Ukrainians are rather more realistic about it. We've known for a long time now about Trump's connections with Russia, his links to Russian money. None of that has gone away. And his advisor on this, Steve Witkoff, still has business relationships with Len Blavatnik currently, a Russian-Ukrainian oligarch. These things aren't changing. It's all there for the public to see if they wanted to do it. But we are being strung along by this, as I said, a game of political theatre where Trump says one thing one day and we report on it, and then he says another thing the next day and we report on it. But we don't look at what the actions are, and the actions are consistent. Trump is consistently not putting pressure on Russia to come to provide a meaningful solution that could bring peace to and end this war.
And of course, today is Trump's deadline for Putin to he had said it had to bring forward essentially a full ceasefire. I assume that most of the people you've been speaking to in Ukraine will have been expecting this tactic from Russia we've become somewhat familiar with, which wait till the last minute, call for talks, and then back down over the details of said talks.
Yes, I mean, I think people have got used to it. They've heard big promises and they haven't been delivered. I think the Ukrainians did welcome the opportunity to have discussions with the Russians. As I said, a lot of people being returned home, meeting their families for the first time, sometimes in 3 years after being held in abject conditions in Russian prisoner of war camps. Those are positive things. But it's really kind of window dressing for the awful suffering that is still happening in Ukraine right now. You know, the number of civilians dying in Russian airstrikes is the highest that it's been since 2022, according to the UN. And Russia is striking Ukrainian cities with 10 times more ordnance than it did this time last year. So, you know, the situation for Ukrainians is pretty dire. And really, they are looking to the Europeans now to see what kind of support they can provide in this period. And I think a lot of people are thinking, well, we just need to survive the Trump presidency, and maybe something will change after that.
And Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has said, while he's not sure about, he hasn't said anything specific about these talks, he said that he believes that a freeze of some sort in this conflict could be close. You mentioned Europe there. What will Ukraine be hoping to do to prevent Russia restarting this conflict if some sort of ceasefire or just freeze in the lines of where the war is right now does happen?
Well, the big if, but if there is a freeze in the conflict, then Ukraine would obviously be looking to adhere to that and to publicize as widely as possible any violations of it, and ensure that there is some kind of monitoring of the ceasefire in place. I mean, there was during the 2014 to 2022 conflict in the Donbass, there was a OSCE monitoring mission that was highlighting ceasefire violations, and that was roundly criticized by the Ukrainians for not pointing the finger of blame at the Russians, which count the number of ceasefire violations. But it did serve a purpose in showing that there were still violations of the ceasefire. Donald Tusk's comments are very interesting. You know, it's unusually optimistic from the Polish side. But from my private conversations with diplomats in Kiev, it seems like Europe believes that going along with the idea of peace talks they said to me, in fact, is the only game in town. There's nothing else we can do. We're just trying to keep the Americans as on side as we can, try and keep the optimism upbeat, try and keep some kind of dialogue going and prevent the US from withdrawing completely from the process, which would also mean cutting what minimal aid there is to Ukraine, and more importantly, maybe lifting the sanctions against Russia if they just see there is no progress on the Ukrainian side, and if Europe risks alienating the US and not aligning on policy. So Europe is trying to maintain some kind of cautious optimism here in order to prevent the worst case scenario.
And we're often told that what Putin might be trying to achieve with these talks is simply to freeze the war so that Russia can rebuild its forces. Presumably, if that happens, Ukraine will want to do the same. Is that possible with European support alone, that they could rebuild their military to a point that they could rebuff a further Russian attack?
Yes, I would say at this point, a freeze in the conflict would play into Ukrainian hands better. It would give Europe more time to spend the new money that is allocated to defense, particularly in Germany, billions and billions of extra money being allocated to defense, and a lot of that going to Ukraine. It allows new European systems like the SAMP-T, which is being a new version which is being developed in France and Italy, which can counter Russian ballistic missiles and would remove that huge dependence that Ukraine has now on Patriots. So there are certain things, certain technological breakthroughs that could help Ukraine in the long run. It would also really help give Ukraine rest its soldiers, rotate them. It would help Ukraine bringing in a new crop of mobilized soldiers who would know that they were going to be trained for a period of time before being immediately deployed to the front line. So it would really help Ukraine to pause the conflict. And that's precisely the reason that I think that Russia is not really interested in that. Russia sees now that it's got the momentum. It's making, although incremental gains, it is surrounding two key towns in the Donbass, Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk. And Putin won't want to lose that momentum. He's also designed his economy now to be it's a proper war machine. So if he starts ending or moving towards kind of demobilization or decreasing the military effort, that's going to do damage to an economy that is now surviving because it is invested in the military and defense complex.
And another outcome Russia will presumably be trying to avoid is the idea that Europe could send troops into Ukraine if there is a ceasefire. Trump's never said back down from that idea. Is it something Ukraine would still go for if they had the opportunity?
Yeah, well, Ukraine would hugely welcome having European troops inside Ukraine, even if that was just in Western Ukraine or along the border with Belarus in the western part of Ukraine, away from the front line. That would just safeguard some areas of territory and prevent them having to deploy soldiers all across the territory, particularly air defense units, which have to be deployed in the west of Ukraine, as well as the frontline areas. So that would be a real boost to Ukraine and a huge disincentive to Russia to attack those regions. But obviously that means it's something that Russia considers a red line, and Putin has said time and time again that he will not accept that.
Well, while all of this goes on the world stage, of course, the conflict in Ukraine carries on every day, and it really is a very deadly war. You've been writing about your time on the front just recently. You've spent time with an air defense unit. Can you tell us first about how they were dodging these incoming attacks from Russian jets?
So we were in a control cabin of an anti-aircraft battery dug into a tree line in the front lines near Izium, the town of Izium. And it was absolutely atrocious weather. We were kind of hunkering down in this control cabin. There were 11 screens with all kinds of different battlefield information being fed into it. And I noticed that one of them was a large radar screen. And I could see a lot of activity there. So I asked the operator, what's happening on that radar screen. And he was looking very intently at it. And he said, these are two Russian jets. This is a Sukhoi 34 and a Sukhoi 35 providing cover for it. And they were flying what looked like directly for our position. And he told me that when they get to about 70 kilometers out, they could release these cab glide bombs, which could have hit our position if they'd spotted it. So there was a kind of tense few minutes while we saw where those jets were going. Eventually they veered off to another position where I discovered that the actual anti-aircraft battery was not operating, that this was a radar from another battery, a more powerful battery further away, that could see these jets, and the Russian jets could not see our position, luckily, and so they bombed somewhere else.
And the reason that they were trying to avoid the jets themselves is that they were actually trying to hunt down Russia's Shahed drones. Have Ukraine found a way here to try and stop those drone swarms?
So Ukraine has been testing. This was a really cutting-edge technology battlefield test that we saw, and we had very exclusive access to it. It's a US company, a startup company, but with very, very serious backing in the US, that is designing fast fixed-wing interceptors which can take down Russian Shahed drones. Now, the Shahed drone is becoming increasingly important in this war. President Putin is clearly gambling on the Shaheds and mass production of them to break the will of the Ukrainian people. There are hundreds of Shahed drones attacking Ukrainian cities nightly now. And his ambition seems to be to expand production until he can attack in the thousands of every day and simply overwhelm Ukraine's air defense capabilities, which are based largely on very expensive Western missiles that are often more expensive to produce than the Shaheds and being produced in smaller numbers. So these interceptor drones could be, if they're scaled up and they work efficiently, could be a game changer in saving Ukrainian cities from these waves of drones. And I was with the Third Army Corps who were testing these in order to see how they work against the Shaheds and whether the manufacture should be ramped up. And the battlefield testing has been rather successful. They said that they'd shot down, I think it's now around 80 Shahed drones in the past 2 months. They've had to adapt because the Russians have changed their tactics. They've developed the Shaheds with an ability to maneuver and avoid at the last minute these interceptors, and so the interceptors have had to be updated to then attack the Shaheds even when they're maneuvering and follow those maneuvers, not be put off by them. And it was really fascinating to watch how they tracked and attacked these Shahed drones, the kind of quality of the camera, the quality of the targeting information, the thermal imaging on this camera from miles away that could show very detailed parts of the Shahed engine as it honed in on it. And I can't describe exactly how they work because it's still it's still classified information, but it was fascinating and optimistic to see that Ukraine is getting its hand on this kind of technology.
And this team you were with, then they were actually testing this equipment live on the battlefield. This isn't the kind of thing that's been distributed yet to most Ukrainian anti-aircraft teams, presumably.
No, there's maybe 1 or 2 batteries that operate with this kind of fixed-wing interceptor. They think it's the most successful type that they've tried. Ukraine has been trying lots of different interceptor drones to try and bring down these Shaheds at a lower cost. And they were very optimistic with the results that they're having. They said that the company they worked with was incredible in providing a kind of 24-hour remote support. So if something goes wrong with the system, they can immediately contact the guys. And I saw that happen. It's very complicated technology, which is having to work in very difficult battlefield conditions. The day that we went with them was a real thunderstorm. It was pouring with rain, and they had to have tarpaulin over all of these things and try and keep the cables dry in the control cabin to make sure they could operate them. And there were a lot of teething issues that they had to work through. But the idea is that they give all of this feedback to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer can improve the product, make it easier for the soldiers on the ground to operate in different conditions. And I've spoken to them since being out on that frontline mission, and they said that the technology is only getting better, and the manufacturer is improving it all the time. And they're very optimistic that this could be a solution to stopping these waves of hundreds of Shaheds killing more Ukrainian civilians.
And we hear a lot about the technology race that is going on the front lines of this conflict very often, and that one of the key ways Ukraine have been able to keep the edge over Russia, which for everything else is a much larger military with oftentimes more quantity of resources to spend on this conflict. We hear that this technology is what is keeping Ukraine in the fight. Did you get a sense that is still generally what is going on here, that Ukraine can keep the edge over Russia? Or have Russia really found quite a difficult thing for Ukraine to solve in the Shahed drone?
Well, Russia is obviously able to mass produce things more effectively than Ukraine can, and at a greater scale, and especially with partners in China. That some drone factories are now in China. Russian defense companies operating factories in China, and that enables them to have an advantage in the terms of how they produce these and the numbers they produce them in. Ukraine has had an advantage in the past of being very savvy, being more creative, coming up with more creative solutions, also being able to draw on the support of European countries and the US and all of that know-how in the technological sector there. And that is definitely helping Ukraine, and that is an advantage that Ukraine has over Russia. I think the challenge is how to scale it up and how to make sure it makes efficient use of them, because we've had a couple of corruption scandals in Ukraine lately related to drone procurement, not the procurement of these drones, but other drones, which show that corruption is still a challenge in Ukraine, and Ukraine needs to be making every single one of its dollars count much more than the Russians. Russia, one of the advantages Ukraine has over Russia is being a far less corrupt society. There's huge corruption in Russia's military and defense industry, and that undermines it. So that gives Ukraine an advantage as well, and they really need to capitalize on it. Another problem Ukraine has had is in mobilizing people who are working in the private sector on military tech enterprises who don't necessarily get reservations that exempt them from military service, and they end up serving on the front lines, which is a waste of talent, and also potentially allows the enemy to get their hands on Militech engineering knowledge. So Ukraine has to deal with that in a much better way than it's been doing so far. We've also had rival tech companies trying to ensure that their people are protected while other companies get their staff sent to the front line, and that's also unhelpful. So Ukraine really needs to find a way to make the best use of its talents in engineering, and that's actually the Third Army Corps that I visited are striving to do. They're really looking to attract the best entrepreneurs, the best minds in Miltech, and work with them and open up the battlefield to testing and to give them all the opportunities that they can to test new technology. And it's really quite a revolutionary approach in a quite still outdated Ukrainian armed forces, which is still very bureaucratic. They're doing something new. They're working with lots of Western defense manufacturers, and they're having successes as a result.
And just finally, Maxim, when we last spoke, you did mention that you had your own close shave with one of these Shahed drones after you had left the direct front lines. But I think you've been writing about that in slightly more detail this week. What can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, so one of the things is tech. The other things is always the human factor. So the Russians have been adapting these Shahed drones, improving the tech so that they can evade the new interceptors. But the Russians can also change the tactics. For example, when they deploy them, what time they deploy them, and Ukraine is always braced at nighttime for these waves of Shaheds, which will go through. From midnight till the early hours of the morning, till 7 or 8 sometimes. We didn't see any Shaheds, perhaps because of the weather, perhaps because the airfield that the Russians were launching them had been hit by Ukrainian long-range drones the night before, and we saw actually on radar again Ukrainian drones going and hitting that Russian airbase again. But in the morning, when we thought after a long night on the front lines and thought we would go back to our apartment building and get some rest in the city of Izium. In broad daylight on a weekday, the Russians launched 2 Shahed drones, which obviously the Ukrainians weren't quite prepared for because it was the middle of the day, and they went whizzing over the roof of our building. I mean, maybe 10 meters away, and it's this terrifying sound where you can hear the engine whining and get louder and louder and louder as it descends upon you, and you really think that's it. I mean, that was one of the situations where you're on the floor and you're waiting for the Shahed to hit your building and see what happens next. Just get behind cover as best you can. And luckily, although it went very close to our building, it hit a building not next door, but one more away from it, about 500 meters away. And that was the first Shahed. And then you kind of get up and go, oh, that was a close call. And then you hear another one coming for you. It was a pretty unpleasant experience, but also one that is sadly becoming commonplace for many Ukrainians, given that there are so many hundreds of these Shaheds in the air every night.
Well, Maxim, it's a terrifying story, but it's one I'm sure our audience really appreciate you being able to bring to us. So thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me, Louis. Always a pleasure.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.